Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is Kerncliffe Park in Burlington, Ontario. I was watching Books and Lala's channel, and she mentioned the Canadian-themed Read-eh-thon, so I thought, I better go to Canada to shoot a video. So while I didn't technically travel to Canada specifically to do the readathon, I did think it was funny that the timing worked out like that. I didn't take near as much video as I originally intended to on this particular trip, which I'm clearly now back from, but back in April, when I also traveled to Toronto, I did take some more video. So I'm going to insert some footage both of the Burlington hiking from this particular trip, and also some footage from both downtown and from Scarborough from back in April. You'll be able to tell the difference because in the one it's a lush green summery kind of background, and in the other it's clearly still cold. So the Read-eh-thon was hosted by, I believe, 4 different people. As I said, I saw it on Books and Lala's channel, and I know I saw on Twitter that Joss from Schools Reads was hosting some of the Twitter sprints, which I don't participate in, but I was following anyway, and there were a couple of other people, and I will link to all of them below. The readathon itself had 5 challenges. One was to read a book with red on the cover, one was to read a book with EH in the title, one was to read a book by a female Canadian author, one was to read a book by an indigenous Canadian author, and 5 was to read a book from a province you've never been to. In the end, I read 3 books, which were David Chariandy's Brother, which has an orangey red title, so we'll go for red with that. The next was Eden Robinson's The Sasquatch at Home, and Eden Robinson is both female and indigenous, so that checks off those 2 challenges. And the third was Islands of Decolonial Love by Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, and she is also female and indigenous. I did not manage to check the box of a province you've never been to, because The Sasquatch at Home is set in British Columbia, which I have, and while I've never been to the areas that are primarily mentioned in that, I've definitely been to the Lower Mainland many times. I used to have to go to Vancouver for work at least once a year. And Brother is set in Ontario, and specifically in Scarborough, which is where I grew up, so clearly I've been there. And Islands of Decolonial Love was primarily in Ontario, but there were bits that were Nova Scotia, which, again, places I have been. So enough with the challenges, let's talk about the books. I will start with Brother. This was on the Canada Reads long list this past year. It didn't make the short list. It is basically about what happens within a family after an act of police brutality, more or less. It goes back and forth in time and is primarily about the relationship between 2 brothers and their mother, and their lives growing up basically in a very kind of lower working class family with their Trinidadian single mother, and the interactions between the 2 brothers and their mother, and how that changes over time. The story goes back and forth a bit in their lives. At the sort of present day point, the one brother has just invited a former neighbor to come and stay with them. Her father has just died, and they're thinking about their history. This is definitely a depressing story, but I enjoyed it and found it easy to engage with. I don't know how memorable this is going to be. I had read David Chariandy's Sukiyant a few years ago, and I remember really liking it when I read it, but I honestly can't remember much else about it. So I don't know how much this is going to stick with me. I think because of where this is set, it's hard not to compare it with Catherine Hernandez's Scarborough, which is set in more or less the same area. This is a little further north. These characters are around Markham and Lawrence, and those characters were down around Kingston Road, which is not a huge difference in terms of geography, but I think was a bit of a difference in terms of culture. I thought this was funny. I read this on the plane as I was heading over, and then I had to go to the Service Ontario Centre, and I went to the one at Cedar Brae Mall, which is at Markham and Lawrence, and I did think it captured the area and the neighborhood, and I felt like this was more recognizably Scarborough than Catherine Hernandez's Scarborough was, at least for me. So I thought that was interesting. The main touch point of this story actually is a lot like a story that when I was in high school, they were 2 Jamaican brothers as opposed to 2 Trinidadian brothers in that story, and the story that they told had been exaggerated to a point that it was the story that actually happens here. So it was very sort of relatable in that sense, in that you think this is something that could have happened, but it's not the exaggerated form, so it's extra depressing. This was well done. I understand why it didn't make the long list, because it is so short. It leaves you with more questions than answers, but not in a challenging way necessarily, although there is some of that, but in a general way as well, which was maybe a bit of a weakness, but I still quite liked this. The next book that I'll talk about is Eden Robinson's The Sasquatch at Home. This is another publication that the University of Alberta put out, which are printings of lectures that various authors gave. This one consists of 3 main stories, 2 of which are about Haisla Nation activities and reflections on things like doing things the old way is now something that only the rich can do because it's cheaper to buy a bunch of frozen fish than to go through the process of fishing and processing, and reflections like that. There is another essay in this that is about the author going to Graceland with her mother, and about if you don't go to Graceland with an Elvis fan, you're missing out. And it compares it to doing something child-friendly without a child, and how you miss out on the sense of wonder. And I thought that was charming. So yeah, this was a charming set of essays. I was saying that Brother is short. This is even shorter. It's half that length. But it was a great read, and I really appreciate that the University of Alberta is putting these out. I think I've talked about, what was it? It was Thompson Highway's lecture about languages, and I thought that was brilliant too. So I love that these are being put out so that we can read them. And then finally, Islands of Decolonial Love. This is listed as Stories and Songs, says the subheading. I read the ebook of this, and within the ebook there were links to recordings of music of a number of the pieces in here. So the ones that are the songs are much more clearly poetry, but even the stories are written in a very poetic way with a bit of a non-standard phrasing and non-standard layout. So I really enjoyed that stylistically. I thought that was great. The opening story in here is a bit about going out in a boat as a tourist in Nova Scotia, and I thought that was a fantastic opening. And then it goes back and you end up in Ontario, and it's about more day-to-day life, but I loved the introduction to this. So this was great. I know I've seen people talking about some of the author's more recent writing lately, and I'm definitely looking forward to picking up more of her stuff because I thought that was great. So I didn't do a lot of Canadian reading, but so those were the 3 Canadian books that I read over the past week and a half. I'm going to do a separate wrap-up for everything else. And thanks to the hosts of the Read-eh-thon for knocking into things, for coming up with the idea. And I will leave you with a couple of shots of the trail in Kerncliffe Park on the Niagara Escarpment. That's it for now. Ciao.